Hello everybody, my name is Bill Cope. I'm a professor in the College of Education here at the University of Illinois, and for some time now I've been working in the area of technology mediated learning, online learning, with a particular emphasis not so much on the technologies but on the pedagogical possibilities in these spaces. Now, we're in this very strange moment where we've been thrown into online learning, whether we like it or not, as a result of this COVID crisis. So thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to this online teaching academy. It's very important that we try and think through what we do in online education. So the topic that was suggested to me by the organisers was the future of online learning. And where I want to start is I want to start with a definition. So because people are talking about online learning, remote learning, and sometimes the obvious needs to be discussed. The obvious isn't so obvious. So for me, online learning is any forms of learning interactions that are supported by connected digital devices. And for me, then, online is not a synonym for remote. And it has two sort of fundamental modalities. One is in-person with online support, and remote learning, which is these days primarily online. There's a long history, of course, of distance education, which involved other media, but now today it's primarily online, in terms of this definition of network digital devices. But in terms of in-person as well, these technologies, these devices, and these modes of actually interaction and learning are becoming integral to in-person as well. So hopefully, as this crisis recedes and when people who haven't taught online in the past go back to in-person teaching, hopefully there will be some lessons learned, and I hope they're not negative ones in terms of it was a horrible experience. So why is the semantics important? And for me, the semantics of online is important because the online infrastructure and its pedagogical potentials are the same for in-person and remote. Whether you're using online to support in-person or online for remote learning, the technologies and the kinds of learning relationships that we can forge are not different in any significant way. But what I want to do is I want to start with online education, a short version of a long history. In fact, my training before I got into technology education is a historian. So I always like to try and think through what we're doing in terms of these narratives of time. The people may or may not know that the world's first e-learning system was Plato, which was a project which was begun here at the University of Illinois in 1959. And it's a kind of apocryphal story in a way, which is, one aspect of it is, oh my goodness, 1959 is an incredibly long time ago. So this stuff hasn't come out of the blue from nowhere. But the apocryphal part of the story is that incidental to Plato were some foundational technologies. So, before this point, a computer hadn't really processed human language. I mean, you need human language to be operating across a human interface. So in fact, what this became was messaging systems and one of the first email programs, Eudora. So here we are dealing with language. Here we are dealing with a visual interface. So the plasma screen gets invented as a way for the computer to interact with human beings. And a whole lot of other things. The first emojis, the first synthesized sound, the first games. And these things were all incidental to this creation of Plato. So here we are, this foundational series of modern technologies were created incidentally to what I would call online learning in my broad definition. Moving forward now, of course, on the right side of this screen here, Mosaic, the world's first web browser, was created here at the University of Illinois. But I think people are not kind of aware of this, that I believe that we actually had the world's first fully online degree. Now, when I say I believe, I'm actually involved in a project writing a history of the College of Education at the moment, and I've asked the people who are involved in creating HRE online back in 1998 whether they know of any other fully online degrees in the world, and they said, look, we don't know of anything. I mean, you know, surely if they were creating this thing, they would have known. So I'm going to claim another historical first here for the University of Illinois, and until I'm proved wrong, until somebody volunteers that something else was sooner. But then another huge milestone, 2012, is our getting involved with Coursera. We weren't the first university to get involved, but we were right there at the start in the very first months of these first large-scale MOOC. And this list of MOOCs that are here that I put on the screen are in fact the courses that we offer in our Learning Design and Leadership program. So what we do as an exercise in just trying to understand the medium is we put all our courses in Coursera, but also they're the same courses that we teach for our to our masters and our doctoral students as well in our masters and doctoral programs. I don't know whether people know this, and it's undervalued and under-recognised that in the 8 years since we began in the MOOC universe, the University of Illinois has had 4.5 million enrolments. And people say, oh, the attrition rate's terrible. Well, no, the attrition rate isn't terrible because people get into MOOCs for different reasons. I dip into MOOCs because I want to know a bit about something, and I get halfway through the videos and I get it. And I don't need to watch the rest of the videos, and I don't need the certificate. So in other words, people's purposes for enrolment are incredibly varied. And my view is that of the 4.5 million people who enrol, probably nearly all of them get something out of it. And in the nature of MOOCs, they get different things out of it. This is a remarkable achievement, and also, by the way, a significant revenue earner for our university now, and something that I think that I believe we should be very, very proud of. Now, as I said, that all our courses we mirror in Coursera, but we also have the university's first fully online doctoral program where there's incredible demand and amazing students, just incredible students. So one of our interesting experiments is, how does one do an online doctorate? And my answer, which I'm going to talk about a bit more through this talk, is that it's very different. And it's different in some powerful kinds of ways. Not different because of the technology, not different because of the pedagogy. It's just different because we have a different demographic that we're reaching out to, and this allows us to do. And then 2020, COVID-19 arrives, and then suddenly everybody is so-called remote. You know, I've got problems with this word. Well, of course, they are remote, but we're not going to say they're online. We're going to say they're remote, and they're using these online media, which we can also use for in-person. But in a way, COVID, in my view, is a crisis that was bound to come. I think a whole lot of things were coming to a head with higher ed. One thing that was coming to a head was simply matters of access. It's getting expensive. It's getting too expensive for people to access, and a lot of the demographics who we want to access it, historically underserved minorities, for example, it's difficult for them to access. It's expensive. Let's put it bluntly. And the student debt crisis was going to blow at some point. It was just kind of unsustainable. And online is a way to provide a cheaper access. So one of the things about our programs is you can do our course for $49 in Coursera, but also you can enroll for a whole doctoral degree in a relatively inexpensive, accessible kind of way through a whole lot of, you can do the Coursera certificates, you can do a certificate with us, you can do a master's degree. So we offer this whole range of graduate degrees where there are a range of price points, essentially. But the other question is about resourcing. We know that in higher ed that we've found that we've hit a whole set of resource crises, and there are going to be new resource crises now. So not only is it a question of access, we need to find new ways of delivering our content, perhaps low-cost ways, which deliver new revenue streams. And, MOOCs were a very good example of that. But the third crisis is of a totally different order that I want to call attentional. We live in the era of social media, where we're used to flipping through activity streams, speed reading things, picking out what we're interested in, where we get, we're bombarded with messages, but we manage to navigate our way through it. And a lot of what we do in traditional educational models, like lectures, for example, actually have incredibly low cognitive load. Sitting in a classroom listening to one person answer a question when only one person can answer a question at a time is low cognitive load. So I think we've got a problem in terms of the media that we've become very used to. In terms of the media the traditional media that we've used in higher ed, that's a problem for us. Now, of course, people say multitasking doesn't work, there's lack of focus, but the truth is we are moving into a different set of cognitive spaces where sometimes what we do in these spaces is effective, and sometimes what we've done in the past relatively seems less effective. I know, for example, I find it hard to sit in a meeting now without my laptop open and I'm listening out of one ear to the meeting and watching something else go past, and I think I'd find it hard to. And I sit in a lecture now and I look up a book in Amazon, or I look up something on Wikipedia that I don't quite understand, or so I find it hard not to be operating in these multitasking environments anymore. So I think we've got a kind of a change in the zeitgeist, if you like, where we've got to catch up with that in higher ed. So my question now that I want to really go through for the rest of this talk is, more than to support merely remote learning, how can online contribute to learning in general, including in-person learning? And I want to start with some of the foundational artefacts. And I want to start with these artefacts because I want to say, look, we can improve on these artefacts. Online gives us the possibility of improving on those artefacts. The first is the lecture. And this is this quite wonderful quote from St. Benedict, who is the founder of Western monasticism, which became the ancient, or the late medieval universities of Germany and England and Europe, came out of the monastic tradition. The idea of a college came out of the monastic tradition. And this is the kind of fundamental discursive logic of the lecture. You sit and you respectfully listen. The textbook, this is the first significant textbook writer of modern times is a man by the name of Petrus Ramus, one of the most published of early modern authors and one of the most neglected because everything he did was derivative. It was a synthesis of Euclid and Aristotle and a whole lot of other things. But here we have this form of condensing the world to bring it into the student's presence in a classroom in the form of a book, where the idea was you're all on the same page at the same time, and we could start with the simpler idea and go to the more complex, and in a rather laborious, didactic kind of way, we could go from point A to point B, telling the student what they need to know. And then finally, the test. So this is kind of really a late 19th century artefact. And it intensified in the 20th century. I think there's a bit of a reaction against it now for a variety of reasons. But the test has it in it an implicit theory of learning, which is it's the stuff that you can remember, long-term memory. And what's the definition of long-term? Well, until the day after the test. It's a kind of a joke, but it's also kind of true. And what the definition of memory is the separated brain, your individual brain. So collective work, collaborative work, social work, even work where, an example of social work is bringing the book into the exam. An open book exam is social in the sense that you're looking stuff up and you've got these social resources which you're using to fabricate your answer or you construct your answer. And this is what we would call didactic pedagogy. These were the artefacts of the didactic pedagogy, a kind of hub and spoke model where the teacher's the centre of the universe and the students are out there. And John Dewey called this transmission learning. Paulo Freire, the famous Brazilian educator, called this banking education, which is, you kind of banking all this knowledge. And it's essentially also one size fits all, everyone on the same page at the same time, everybody listening at the same to the lecture together, and so on. Then online learning arrives. in my broad definition of online learning, which includes in person, and this is what it looks like. Well, the answer is, in a lot of ways, nothing changes. There's the classroom with the teacher more or less at the front. The kids are all doing their own work. They're even more isolated from each other and they've got their headphones on. And over here on the right is B.F. Skinner, the famous behaviourist psychologist, his teaching machine from 1954. He first described this idea of a teaching machine, but it wasn't electronic then. It was a purely mechanical thing, like a mechanical calculator. But again, the student is isolated with the machine. So in a way, what we end up doing is we kind of go from bad to worse. We reproduce those traditional forms. And we can replicate didactic pedagogies in a whole lot of fronts. We can give out tedious video lectures, of which I'm now complicit in giving you all a tedious video lecture, which goes for the length of a lecture, half an hour or whatever, and you sit there and you watch the darn thing. Now, of course, what we can do is we can modify that. You can turn this up to double speed if you can't stand what I've recorded. You can skip through bits you already know. You can go back over bits that are hard. So there are actually affordances in this video which which give more agency than St. Benedict would have ever allowed. E-textbooks, it's the same architecture that Petrus Ramus did, which is read the chapter, everyone on the same page at the same time, and then answer a quiz at the end, the online test. So what we can do with all of these things is we can use these online environments to replicate those legacy pedagogical architectures. But when we do that, we're actually missing a whole pile of opportunities. I'm not going to go through this diagram because I've gone through it elsewhere, but what we've tried to do with this is, if you like, analyse these 7 quite dramatic potentials which extend or subvert or improve, or whatever word you want to use, didactic pedagogy. So what we're trying to do in the education research we do is think about how does one build new models of learning. Now, the irony is that these are not new models of learning. John Dewey, Maria Montessori, Paulo Freire, a whole lot of people, they've been talking about this kind of thing for a long time. It's just that what online learning does, it makes a lot of this logistically possible, logistically feasible, which wasn't the case before. So what I'm going to do now for the rest of this talk is I'm going to do 2 more things. The first thing is I'm going to take you into some of my classes to show you how things can be different. And then I'm going to draw some conclusions about that. So I'm going to jump out of PowerPoint now, and I am going to go to a browser page where we've been developing a piece of online software called Scholar. And what I'm going to do is share, and I'm going to go back, in fact, to the first tab here, because this is the last tab that I wanted to show you. So this is a web-based environment. We've had a number of grants from the US Department of Education, the National Science Foundation, the Gates Foundation, to build this over a number of years. And essentially it's an experimental space. So what I want to show, the reason why I want to show it to you is you can do things like this in online environments, and also this talk is about the future of online environments, and my job as an education professor is to think through that future rather than to be realistic about the tools that we have today. It's a web-based tool. We have a not-for-profit that makes it available. It's available for free to everybody in the university, of course. You're very welcome to use it if you want to, and just if you want to use it, we can set you up with it. So I'm going to log in now. I've actually opened a couple of tabs already, so I don't have to go clicking around and waste your time and mine. When I log in, I land in an area called Community, this space here, which is a hybrid. Social media is not a great thing for learning. You don't want followers, you don't want friends. It's a different kind of logic. You want more space to be able to write and think things. So, and I don't belong to classes, I belong to communities. There might be several communities in a class or several classes in a community. And I have peers rather than friends or followers. And this down here is a continuous scroll of stuff that's happening in my world. And this happens to be live. This is the stuff that's actually happening in my world now. I'll take you into one of my classes. which is a class on educational technology, obviously, because that's what I teach. And what I've done is I've made a post which is a thing called an update. And you can see here this is the opposite of a tweet. It's substantial. It includes an image, it includes a short video that I've put in. So I think one of the lessons we've learned from... I'll stop it so you don't have two of me talking at once. So yeah, what we do is we build this... we put in short videos, and one of the lessons that we've learned from the MOOC experience is short videos then become accessible. And what I've also done is I've also put in here a reference to an article that we've written, that's a direct link to an article we've written about big data coming to school. So what we've got is we're giving people articles and videos and whatever to read. And what we're doing at the bottom is we're asking for two types of activity. One is to comment. Perhaps it's time for a paradigm shift in educational assessment. Does learning analytics come next? And the students are all talking below, right? I'll come back to the second activity in a moment. So here they are all talking. So this is classical classroom discourse. So whether you're in person or whether you are remote, right? Having this kind of architecture to record that discussion is really important. And the big difference between a real classroom, an in-person classroom discussion, an oral discussion, is there's no record of what was said. You know, I have a little theory, which is the person who puts up their hand and speaks first is always the wrong person, and the people who really should be speaking are not speaking because it's logistically impossible for everyone to speak to the same topic. But here we have everybody speaking to the same topic, and also kind of talking to each other along the way as well. You'll see comments where they're commenting on each other's comments. So this is classical classroom discourse, except we have a record of it. So whether you're in the class together or not, have them typing up answers in class or have them do it overnight. It makes no difference whether it's in person or not. But the other thing we do is we get them to contribute to the class. So the classic kind of transmission model where the teacher tells you and you absorb whatever they're saying, they're going to have to now find an example of an assessment that points the way forward. And they're going to find stuff that I didn't even know about. There's so much stuff happening in the world, and these people are graduate students, and they're out there doing things in their lives. Perhaps they're teaching by day. And I'm jumping across to another course now, because this just happened to be one that was in my activity stream right now. This is an example where a student is telling me about this LMS for music education that I've never heard of. I don't... You know, we have music teachers in our classes as well as science teachers and all kinds of teachers, you know, higher ed, school, all levels as well. But they're actually introducing in this multimodal presentation, so here they put a little video about it, and they put a link to it, and they put some references in there, and then the other students are starting to talk to each other. So they become co-contributors, if you like, in the class. This is the first area, which is, if you like, the classroom discussion area. This is the classroom. The next area, which I'm going to go to now, is an area called Creator, where the students do peer-reviewed projects, right? And I'm coming to some conclusions about this later. I'm just going to show you these examples. So this is a medical student here at the U of I doing, analysing a case study around diabetes. So it's you know, here's this diabetes case. What do you make of it, and what do we do with it? And down on the right is a rubric constructed by the professor: clinical context, clinical actions, clinical analysis, medical communication. And what happens is that if I am to do a review of this, I drag across this little slider. I get good inter-rater reliability if I describe the rating levels carefully. I type in an explanation. And then over here are the results. So I'm going to go to a read-only version of this now. So this is the diabetes project, which has included data and infographics and all kinds of you know, diagrammatic representation. So if you like, it's a multimodal knowledge representation of a clinical case. And here are the results of the work, where this is a summary of the... And what we've shown is that crowdsourcing principles, which is the average of a number of peer reviews, is equal to an instructor or an expert review. And this is one lot of feedback, this is another lot of feedback, this is another lot. So what they're getting is a whole lot of feedback for the revision of their work. So what we're doing is we're involving peers in the assessment process, and not at the end, summative assessment, but in the middle, formative assessment, in order that they can use this feedback for the revision of their work. Now, and by the way, here's another example. This is an engineering example where the students are working out the drag on a kickball. They're putting in all their mathematical formulae, like so. They are putting in an Excel spreadsheet where they did some calculations. And here's a little video of them in the quad. The video has now been deleted. This is their data. Okay, and along the way, by the way, what they've also done annotations, giving each other detailed comments. Anyhow, I'm just giving you a flavour of this kind of collaborative learning activity, and there's a whole lot of complexity in this which just would not be feasible without this online tool. This is an in-person class, but this is an online tool. Now, this is what I want to show you before I go back to my conclusions to this talk. Here we have this analytics environment which we've built recently with a National Science Foundation grant. So what we do is we data mine all this activity, right? And here is, I'm only going to show you the whole class view, but because I'm not going to show you students' results, but this is, every student has an analytics visualization which is identical to this for their own work, right? And by the way, there's nothing that I can see in this analytics that the student can't also see. They can't see the whole group. That's the only thing they can't see, but there's nothing about themselves that they can't see. So what we've done here is we've divided their learning activity up into three major sectors: knowledge, which is demonstrated things that you've learned; focus, which is the amount of work you've done; help, which is a measure of collaboration. We're in a learning community, and this is a measure of collaboration. So, for instance, one of the knowledge measures might be the average peer review score across a rubric. And by the way, this is one of my it's actually a doctoral class, to be quite frank, and a course about educational assessment, of course. So this is the average peer review, but in fact, this is across, a whole lot of peer reviews, multiple peer reviews, and several peer-reviewed projects. Oh, and by the way, before I go further, the circumference of the circle are the objectives, the learning objectives that I've set as an instructor, which I do over here in these admin settings, which takes 15 minutes. It's not that hard to do. And I've weighted knowledge, focus, and help equally. You can weight it any way you want. And this is an Astor plot. Oh, by the way, this is the works that I've published. So I've looked at them as the professor and I've published those. So I can go over all of these things, and what we do, I can see all the things we've asked you to do. And in fact, there are 26 different data types that we're measuring for. And what I can do is I can go into any one of these and I can see exactly what's being measured. We're being completely transparent about the measurements. And in fact, some of these measurements are actually not purely quantitative, because what they are is they are quantitative measures of qualitative learning put across a Likert scale. So in fact, they're not straightforwardly quantitative measures. Some of them are straightforwardly quantitative, some of them are these kind of mixed qualitative and quantitative. So at the end of this class, this was an 8-week class with about 30-40 students. There were over 6,000 pieces of actionable feedback, formative feedback during the learning process, machine feedback and peer feedback, instructor feedback. And this visualization is off 1.7 million data points. So this can't be done, in a normal, with legacy architectures, just can't be done. But this is equally useful whether it's an in-person class or an online class. There is no difference between the two in terms of our intention with this kind of development. So what I'm going to do now is go back to my PowerPoint and draw some conclusions. And for some reason, there it is there. Okay, so I'm going to go share, and we're back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so what does this all mean? So looking ahead, what are the scenarios for the future of online education in my broad definition? So the old gold standard for learning was in person. And we reverse engineered that for online. Right? What we did is we did the tests, we did the e-textbooks, we did the video lectures, and not a lot changed. Things changed, but not hugely. But what I'm interested in is the question of how we re-engineer online so it becomes the new gold standard, how we can learn from online in order to transform in person as well as transforming remote. I'm going to sort of end with 5 transformations. This is stuff which I hope in some ways you've kind of seen happening already through what I've already shown practically, is that, you know, learning can be much more social. Sitting in a lecture theatre is not social. In a classroom where one person talks at a time, it's not actually very social because only one person's talking at a time. We have no record of it. So discussion forums, peer review become incredibly complex social things in a way that our legacy artefacts were never very social, right? What we can have is object-oriented learning. And what I mean by that is not just worrying about what's between your ears that you can remember for the test, but you're building artefacts. You're doing a problem which is you're documenting the problem about the drag on a kickball. You're documenting your particular solution to a clinical case. So these, if you like, is object-oriented learning rather than cognitively oriented learning. We're looking at the knowledge artefact you've constructed, less than the thinking behind it. When we do a test, we're just interested in your thinking only, right? It's also the collaborative mind, not the individual mind. That test is just the individual mind. It's just what you happen to have between your 2 ears when you walk into the closed book test. We're nurturing knowledge community, but also social scales. So one of the things we can do is, you know, if you've got 3 peer reviewers around a piece of work that you're doing, it doesn't matter whether there are 3 in the class or 30 in the class or 300 in the class. We can actually scale these things in a way that they're not, you know, not overwhelming. And that's an important thing to do. Privacy, safety and transparency in social learning. You know, this is your data. We're not going to have any data that you can't see, the learner. You know, there's no secrecy about this. But of course, your data is absolutely private, and your data is a private relationship between the instructor and you. Second thing is equitable learning. And I want to start with this bell curve, an idea that was invented by Henry Goddard, 1920, around the IQ test. These are the IQ test. And by the way, what I want to tell you is 0 to 25 is an idiot, 26 to 50 is an imbecile, 51 to 70 is a moron. Now, we quite like the other end of the scale. We still have above average and gifted and genius. We have all these things because they're not so offensive. But look, one of the things, by having this bell curve, what we're doing is we've let people into a class. So we must know that one way or another, they're capable of doing that class. You know, this is I'm actually talking about the second of my 3 points there first, which is, you know, Benjamin Bloom, a very wonderful educator, famous educator from the University of Chicago, no longer alive, 60 years ago, invented this idea of mastery learning, which is, okay, if they're in the class, we can push the curve. You know, the curve doesn't have to be this way. We can push it over to the right. And how do we do it? By giving students a chance to rework their work, by putting them in groups, there are a whole lot of strategies we can use to push the curve. But our argument with the analytics that I just showed you is we can push the curve by simply being clear about incremental progress towards learning objectives. That's simple. So this is the mastery learning idea. Equity through access, affordability, jumping up to my first point, which is if we can do this stuff cheaper, and, you know, my $49 Coursera courses, which are versions of my master's and doctoral courses, but also productive diversity. So if we've got multiple people, more and more voices visible, more interaction, what we're getting is we're getting the value of the diversity amongst our students in the interactions between our students. Engaged learning. You know, this is moving away from the learner as a knowledge consumer to being a knowledge producer. You know, they're doing kickball projects, they're doing clinical case analyses. And for me, this is what I would call changing the balance of epistemic agency. In the hub and spoke model, the balance of epistemic agency is with the teacher, which is, okay, you know, listen to the lecture, read the textbook, do the test, but the balance of agency has to be one where it's a dialogue both ways. The balance of agency changes in learning. but also life-embedded learning, on-site learning, of applicable learning. My master's and doctoral students who are not on campus, who are remote, are doing these incredible projects related to their work and related to their communities, because we haven't taken them out of the world to this monastic setting, which is the colleges at the University of Illinois. So how do we actually blend that? How do we, yes, bring them for the monastic experience? Yeah, that's okay for in some respects, but also send them out and they're still doing their work in these life-embedded on-site learning experiences. Deep learning. So, what we do with these kinds of tests is this long-term, all we can do with a bubble test or an item-based assessment, which is technically in our trade called select response assessment. All we can do with select response is memory of facts or correct application of procedures. Yes, that's the right answer. And this we would call a certain kind of mentalism, but a very limited kind of mentalism, I might say, because we know the critique of these things. You really understand it, but you just happen to get the wrong answer. You really didn't understand it, but you happen to get the right answer, and so on. It goes on. It's kind of it's folklore. What's wrong with those kinds of tests? But what we've got happening in the drag on the crick, on the ball, and the clinical case analysis, is we've got higher order thinking. We've got creative, critical and design thinking, and we've got thinking happening in action. But the other thing we've got is we've got the thinking happening explicitly. The inference we draw behind the B answer or the D answer in an item-based test is just it's a problematic relationship to actual thinking. Whereas in these things, we've got thinking stated explicitly, clinical thinking, engineering thinking, physics thinking being stated explicitly in these kinds of environments. And my last point, because my sixth point is actually wraps everything else up, my last point is that what we can have is recursive learning. And what I mean by that is to end the distinction between formative and summative assessment. So what I've got happening in these environments here is many, many, many small pieces of feedback which contribute to your learning. And then all summative is a retrospective view of things that happened in the first instance formatively. So in other words, all assessment is for learning, not of learning. And the of learning part at the end is only a retrospective view of everything that was in the first instance for learning. And this for me is the end of the distinction between instruction and assessment. The test is dead. Forget about it, those old form examinations. With big data, with artificial intelligence, with educational data mining, with learning analytics, these are the new technologies and processes, we actually have the end of that distinction. All assessment is embedded in instruction. And there are also incredible potentials with AI and machine learning. And in fact, the project that you see on the screen involved us experimenting with whether the users, the learners in the machine, can train the machine to see higher level thinking along the way and to support learning in the same way that spelling and grammar checkers support writing. They aren't writing, but they help writing. So we can use AI to support learning in those kinds of ways. So my final point then is this changes the job of teaching. Teachers are more important than ever, but their jobs change. They're curating content rather than implementing the textbook. They're creating learning communities where a lot of the energy is in the design of the interactions between students, the rubrics, the discussion forum, prompts, and so on. And they're managing data. They're managing these data-rich feedback systems. So, but along the way, online learning becomes a productivity tool. A lot of what we do as professors is a darn waste of time. We repeat things. We say things more than once. We do a pile of administrative work. Assessment is tedious. We don't often we've got a pile of things to mark, and we don't often do a very good job of it because it's the same damn thing over and over again, and you know everything that's wrong with marking. And then finally, how we might transform our work and reach new constituencies in uncertain times. Can we do this cheaper? Can we avoid the cost of taking yourself out of life for those years and paying for accommodation here away from other people in the world? So this is my kind of conclusion. This is about the future of online learning, is actually the future of learning for all. So thank you very much for being part of this this teaching academy, and I hope I've made a useful contribution to you all.